Coming up, there is a gas cloud seeping into university classes and boardrooms, and a new study reveals the cracks that make it happen.
Grants towards public universities have been declining in the last 20 to 30 years. And so increasingly, universities, not just with fossil fuel corporations, but are interested in making all sorts of partnerships with private industry.
Researchers peek behind the curtain of what is a highly secretive and thriving greenwashing enterprise and name drops the oil and gas companies investing in higher education and why.
Fossil fuel companies we know are already in bed with and have strong influence over the political class. Why infiltrate universities?
President Biden, our lives depend on your actions today. If you don't stop fossil fuels, our blood is on your hands.
And we chat with a group of students and teachers fighting back.
What we've seen happen, especially at U.S. universities over the past couple of decades, is universities turning more and more to corporate interests for research funding, and that's skewing the research agenda in favor of corporate interests away from the common good.
Just 2 degrees is on. Now.
Some people might say universities need money. Why was that a problem?
Universities, they definitely need money, but they also need to, think about who they're trying to serve and what the point of a university is.
The fossil fuel industry is significantly intertwined with higher education around the world. That's how a new study headed by a Michigan University sociology professor begins. It goes on to detail the extent to which oil and gas companies sponsor academic research and scholarships. While giving young minds an opportunity to expand their knowledge is an excellent thing, it does make you wonder where this relationship leads. Since the 1980s, there has been a shift in the way universities operate. Writer Jennifer Washburn, in her exposé, University Inc., The Corporate Corruption of Higher Education, talks about the way fossil fuel companies are transforming aspects of academic life. In essence, the corporate funding of universities is growing, and the money comes with strings attached. It's the premise of a new study led by Sophia Hiltner, a sociology professor in Michigan. She and her researchers looked into the relationship between the decline in education funding in universities across the top 10 biggest emitters on the planet and the financial gaps filled by fossil fuel companies, including the US, the UK, Canada, and Australia. The study also references a 2019 study by Anthony E. Ladd called Priming the Well, Fracademia, and the Corporate Pipeline of Oil and Gas Funding into Higher Education. In it, the North Carolina sociology professor describes historical trends he says set the stage for the corporatization of universities and the fossil fuel industry's influence over US politics. Ladd also details the benefits for these companies, including the reduction of corporate tax burdens through educational contributions, the reduction of employment costs, effectively by training future employees through universities, and greenwashing their image. I rang up Emily Eaton, one of the contributors to the study.
So, Doctor, just to get straight to it, fossil fuel companies we know are already in bed with and have strong influence over the political class. Why infiltrate universities?
That's a great question. Yes, universities have this perception of being, credible, unbiased institutions where rigorous research is conducted. And so, if a fossil fuel company, for example, is trying to advocate for a certain type of policy, then having some research that comes from scientists or policy analysts from an independent, publicly funded organization, for example, is, really helps them with their message and with their credibility, I think.
Okay, then on the flip side, what's the attraction for a university to say, yes, we'll take your money?
That's another good question. Well, we have seen, I'm from Canada, and in Canada, most of our universities are at least nominally publicly funded, but those grants towards public universities have been declining in the last 20 to 30 years. And so increasingly, universities, not just with fossil fuel corporations, but are interested in making all sorts of partnerships with private industry. And one of the things that we wanted to flag in our research was just that, in other industries like pharmaceuticals or tobacco, there are actual mechanisms that universities have put in place because they recognize that these conflicts of interest can result in biases in research outcomes.
I get the impression that fossil fuel sponsorships of study is relatively newer than that of, say, tobacco or anything, or medicine, pharmaceuticals.
Most of the research and most of the reporting from civil society organizations on this has really come forward since about 2003. But certainly the media has been reporting on this before 2003, and it is an older phenomenon, but for some reason it hasn't caught the public's attention, or it hadn't caught the public's attention until much more recently.
Just to understand a bit better as to why universities decide to do that, what happens if a universities stop taking fossil fuel funds? Will many of them have to close their doors? Have they done this as a matter of urgency?
Certainly, one of the things that we're concerned about is, again, just how the sort of channeling of money towards particular types of research projects or particular types of teaching really shapes the knowledge that's produced by universities. We know we're in a climate emergency and that we need to be generating knowledge that will help us sort of phase out fossil fuels. But instead, a tremendous amount of resources, of researchers' time, many of those researchers are public, their salaries are publicly funded, right, is going towards the interests of the industry, the greening, for example, of the fossil fuel industry. There are many student and professor-led organizations that are calling on universities not just to divest their holdings from fossil fuels, but actually to disassociate, to cut their ties to fossil fuels in all sorts of forms. So I think that, it's not unimaginable that we would direct public research to other purposes. And certainly there is funding that's available for other purposes as well. But I don't think universities are going to go broke if they cut ties with the fossil fuel industries. But I think that it also signals like this broader problem, whether it's the fossil fuel industries or any other industries, really that introduces conflict of interest into the universities, and we ought to have a better public funding for our universities so that we can produce, so that we have mandates that are for the public good.
And you mentioned greening just a while ago. Fossil fuels publicly, have kind of shifted their messaging over the years from denying there's a climate crisis to seeming to want to cement their place in the green transition. What does that look like in terms of their funding of projects in universities over the years?
Science that comes out of universities when it's funded by the natural gas industry is overall more favorable to the natural gas industry itself. And so, this is part of the idea of like the social license that this industry needs. If we're going to phase out fossil fuels, they need to be able to tell a story, or phase out fossil fuel emissions, I guess. They need to be able to tell a story that we can still produce fossil fuels with low emissions. And we know that a lot of the technologies that are currently on offer, are very faulty. So I work at the University of Regina in Canada. We have in this province the first carbon capture facility on a coal-fired electrical plant. And there's been a lot of research into carbon capture, into propping up that as a climate solution, when in fact, other researchers have shown, for example, that the technology doesn't work. It never performs to what the industry says it is going to perform to.
Give me your most blatant example of them involving themselves in universities versus the most subtle, insidious example.
Fossil fuel corporations are represented as from those corporations sit on university governing boards. They sit on the boards of sustainability institutes. They have named research chairs. Of course, they invest in research itself. They do training for students, career fairs. Like, there's all sorts of ways in which they infiltrate universities. There's one example that came out of Canada a few years ago at the University of Calgary, a pipeline company, Enbridge, which was trying to get a large pipeline approved in Canada. Decided to sponsor this Enbridge Center for Corporate Sustainability inside the University School of Business. And at the time, the university's president actually served on Enbridge's corporate board and held Enbridge stock herself. And in a news analysis, a media analysis, it was revealed that there was a clear corporate influence going on here. So Enbridge had the right to stop funding at any time that it was dissatisfied with the center. It sought influence over staffing. In the center, it sought influence over student awards. It had board membership on the center, and it negotiated opportunities for its own executives and clients to sort of meet with researchers at the business school.
Well, students on university campuses have also investigated the infiltration of big oil into academia. And they believe Emily and her co-authors' findings only reinforce what they already knew. A 2023 investigation by the nonprofit Data for Progress uncovered hundreds of millions of dollars donated by fossil fuel companies to fund climate research at dozens of academic institutions. I spoke with Jake Lowe, one of the students involved in the analysis.
Research by you and others found that I think it was 27 universities received more than $675 million in fossil fuel industry funding. Some people might say universities need money. Why was that a problem?
Yeah, universities, they definitely need money, but they also need to, think about who they're trying to serve and like what the point of a university is. And like me and the students I work with, I'm also involved with an organization called Campus Climate Network. I think that universities should serve people and the common good and not corporate interests. And what we've seen happen, especially at US universities over the past couple of decades, is universities turning more and more to corporate interests for research funding. And that's skewing the research agenda in favor of corporate interests away from the common good. And we ultimately think it's not worth it. Especially on an issue as important as climate change. A lot would argue it's like the defining issue of our generation. We think it's pretty inexcusable to say that the people who caused the climate crisis, the fossil fuel companies, are the only ones who should be funding research about the solution. So we think it's also like the responsibility of other research funders that aren't fossil fuel companies, as well as like federal funders of research, to really like make this a priority in a way that they haven't always done.
Before I get into exactly what you found in the past, I'm surprised universities lets you investigate, I guess, conflicts of interest within their walls and in their business dealings. How did you make it happen?
Well, to be honest, universities aren't very transparent about this kind of thing. That $600+ million figure we found, we're really confident that's just the bottom line of what is likely a much bigger number. This research project that we're talking about today is the product of everything we could find that is publicly available. So some of the nonprofit wings of fossil fuel companies are legally obligated to disclose some of the donations that they make, and sometimes universities will publicly disclose, the funding that they receive.
In a study titled "Accountable Allies: The Undue Influence of Fossil Fuel Money in Academia," you were quoted as saying, "The power to direct funding means the power to shape which questions are asked and which are not," end quote. What questions do you think fossil fuel companies are most afraid of answering?
I think they're afraid of answering questions that, take seriously the reality that a just energy transition means the phase out of fossil fuels. We can't simultaneously have an energy system reliant on fossil fuels and a climate just future at the same time. And so that means that the fossil fuel industry is going to prioritize climate and energy related research that gives them a pathway to still have a seat at the table. So instead of focusing on a fully renewable energy future, they're thinking about ways to research carbon capture that allows the continued extraction and emission of fossil fuels in a just way that we don't think is actually as just as they make it out to be. It means they're finding ways to explore, natural gas that maybe is more adequately named fracked gas or fossil gas, as a transition fuel. So those are the kinds of priorities that they uplift.
Interesting. Can you give an example of, I guess, one of the more insidious relationships you've discovered between a fossil fuel company and a university? Help us understand the audacity of exactly what's been happening.
Yeah, the first one that comes to mind is at Princeton University. And, if you look up Princeton University fossil fuel ties, you're actually going to first find news that looks really promising. A couple years ago, Princeton made this big announcement that they were going to divest from fossil fuels and dissociate from numerous fossil fuel companies, which means they weren't going to accept research funding. But it was a really specific list, and one of the most important companies that was not included on that list was BP. And BP funds something at Princeton called the Carbon Mitigation Initiative, which, like I was talking about earlier, is really focused on energy transition solutions that have a role for fossil fuels. So they're really focused on carbon capture in particular. And this Carbon Mitigation Initiative is considered by a lot of people to be really prestigious. And they helped produce this study called the Net Zero America Report that had this whole pathway or a series of pathways for an energy transition in the United States. And there was a heavy emphasis on carbon capture in all of those pathways. And that report got a lot of attention. And it was even referenced by the Biden administration when it came to informing his energy plan. So, by kind of cloaking themselves behind a university, fossil fuel companies are able to gain a lot of credibility, even with people who might by some be perceived as more hostile toward the fossil fuel industry. And we've even seen in kind of internal emails that have been released that they talk about this as part of their strategy. They talk about how universities give them access to policymakers that they couldn't get otherwise, and access to influence on policy that they couldn't achieve on their own. So yeah, that's one example.
Do you think there's any credit in saying that they also are trying to mold these brilliant minds at these prestigious universities, future policymakers as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of sort of industry-friendly talking points or approaches to the climate crisis that fossil fuel companies will try to reflect. We've seen other examples, such as at Louisiana State University, where in exchange for the research funding, these fossil fuel companies are being given the right to influence curriculum and oversee what research is being done. They want to be on those campuses to present themselves to students who are studying engineering, for instance, and try to bring them in and try to posture themselves as a good place to work for students. And yeah, so all of that is true.
Have you ever been able to question a fossil fuel company about its sponsorship motives?
We've never been able to talk to one directly, and not many journalists have had much success there. But everything we can gather just from like common sense and from like internal language that has been released, and just like the broader narrative, it seems really clear that what I just described is exactly what the fossil fuel industry is trying to do.
Do you think what you're doing at Campus Climate Network is a fight you could win?
Absolutely. I mean, for over a decade now, we've seen the growth and success of the fossil fuel divestment movement. Dozens of universities across the US and around the world have made the decision to no longer invest their endowments in fossil fuels.
Do you think they're all telling the truth?
There are numerous cases where, yeah, like universities have honestly divested. Holding them accountable and making sure they actually do what they want to say is something that a lot of students are doing now. And in some cases, like there are fights that are ongoing, even though divestment has been promised. But there's definitely wins we can point to in the student climate movement over the past like 10 years or so. And divestment, so getting a university to stop giving money to fossil fuel companies is a huge win. But like as our research shows, that's not the only way that universities are enabling big oil. So yeah, we're still kind of in the early stages of this movement for what we call fossil-free research. But it's something we definitely know we can win. We've already seen some examples of success, mostly outside of the US. Cambridge University recently announced a pretty promising policy that's not perfect, but is really promising. That's going to make it a lot harder for fossil fuel companies to fund research on their campus. Another university in the Netherlands has made a really strong fossil-free research policy. And these are all just in the past couple of years. Fossil-free research isn't a term that anybody was using 3 years ago. So we're connected to, dozens of student groups representing hundreds, if not thousands of students across the US and around the world who are doing the same research that we're doing to uncover these fossil fuel ties that have gone unnoticed for so long, and building support to win. So it might be a long fight, but it's definitely one I know that we can win across the US and around the world.
And that's our show. But before I leave you, you've heard from both a student and a professor about the urgent need for higher education institutions to sever ties with fossil fuel corporations. Here are images of students and faculty rallying against what they say is excessive influence of oil and gas companies on their campuses and in climate policy decisions.
Whose democracy? Our democracy! Whose democracy? Our democracy! Whose planet? Our planet! Whose future? Our future! Whose future? Our future! Whose future? Our future! No more coal! No more oil! Keep the carbon in the soil! No more coal! No more oil! Keep the carbon in the soil! No more coal! No more oil! Keep the carbon in the
Get up, get down, leave fossil fuels in the ground.
Get up, get down, leave fossil fuels in the ground.
fully support and
Disclose, divest, or this movement will not rest. Disclose, divest, or this movement will not rest. Disclose, divest, or this movement will not rest. Disclose, divest, or this movement